everybody. My name is John Bunzl. I'm the founder of the International Simultaneous Policy Organization. And I'd like to thank Bruce Alderman from the Integral Stage for inviting me to contribute this episode in the Eutopia series. I have a PowerPoint to show you because I've got quite a lot of information because after all, Eutopia is supposed to be about concrete, realistic utopias. And what I have to present to you is very concrete and very realistic too. I hope you'll agree. So I'm just going to move to a PowerPoint presentation shortly. I'm just going to quickly minimize my photo and then move to PowerPoint. So I hope you can all see that clearly now. Yeah, so the simultaneous policy is really a pathway to global cooperation. And the reason that global cooperation is so vital now only really becomes apparent if we take an evolutionary perspective on the world, if we zoom out to really see from afar what's going on in the world today and why. Now, an evolutionary perspective is really important because what it makes you realize is that the problems we're facing on the planet today in this era of globalization are actually nothing new. And you only really understand that if you take a look at evolutionary biology. Evolutionary biology, for example, will tell the story of the transition of protocells to nucleated cells. Nucleated cells are the cells that we and other animals are all made of. But prior to those nucleated cells, there were only protocells billions of years ago. And those protocells couldn't get any further because they contained lots of competing microorganisms that were all competing with each other, and they frequently competed the cell to death, or other microorganisms from other cells would invade those cells. And so it was chaotic and highly competitive and destructive, and evolution couldn't move on. But eventually, one entity in the protocell managed to orchestrate cooperation. It managed to align the interests, the individual interests of all the microorganisms within the cell wall with the interests of the cell as a whole. And that entity is what became the nucleus. And that transition was the transition from the protocell to the nucleated cell. And in a sense, that transition, if you imagine the protocell as on the nanoscale as our Earth today on the macro scale, you can see that the problem of bringing those microorganisms to cooperate is very much similar to the problem we face today in the globe of trying to get the world's nations to cooperate to deal with problems like climate change, wealth inequality, nuclear weapons, or any other global problem you care to think of. So globalization, in a sense, is nothing new. The other important thing that evolutionary biology teaches us is that competition paradoxically drives cooperation. So competition is really the default mode of life. And that competition for a while is very healthy because all of the entities are competing, and that drives innovation, it drives excellence, it drives efficiency. But eventually a point is reached where the fruitful space for competition runs out. And then the competition becomes highly destructive. And that destructiveness threatens everybody because the paradigm shifts from a sort of win-lose, I win, you lose, to a lose-lose, where we all lose because the competition has become so destructive. And that threat of wipeout actually drives the incentive for cooperation, because very quickly the situation becomes either we cooperate and survive, or we carry on competing and we all die. So competition drives cooperation at ever higher levels. And in human societies, that process has actually driven an expansion in scale of human social units. So in the stages of prehistory, there were only small families, and then they aggregated into larger tribes. Tribes then competed with each other and eventually learned to cooperate to form themselves into small states or city states in the Middle Ages. And then again, those city states were competing with each other, and that eventually also drove a critical destructive situation, which then drove them to aggregate into larger nation states. And now today, here we are in the 21st century, faced with the same problem, but at the bigger global scale, where it's a question of how do we get nation states to cooperate to solve the global problems that face us now. So evolution has a trajectory. It's not completely random. It has a very discernible trajectory to ever larger scales of cooperation and governance. And if you're interested, you can look into this in more detail, into what's called multi-level selection theory. So there are, in particular, books by David Sloan, the evolutionary biologist David Sloan Wilson, are particularly good. And also, though, I would encourage you to look at the work of John Stewart, another evolutionary biologist who adds to the theory of multi-level selection and emphasizes the importance of management, that at each scale of, in each social unit or each scale of cooperation, there had to be somebody who was managing the process. So in the tribe, it might have been the tribal elder or the elders. In a middle-aged small state, it might have been the king. And in a nation now in the modern era, it might be a parliament. But so there is always an organ of management that actually orchestrates the cooperation. In the nucleated cell, as I said, it was the nucleus. So again, management is a critical aspect of this process. So what drives this expansion of human social units? Well, the short answer is new technology. Because whenever a game-changing new technology is created or invented, it creates what I call an unforeseen new context for governance. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. So back in the days of prehistory, you had hunter-gatherer tribes. But then when the technology of farming was invented, that created a new context for governance, because the old governance of the tribal elders governing who, the affairs of the tribe was completely inappropriate when farming started, because farming meant that food could be produced in mass, it had to be stored, it had to be administered. So it gave rise to a whole hierarchy of different, much more complex social order, which the tribal governance methods just couldn't deal with. And so eventually, so what happens is that new technology is created, it undermines the existing level of governance, in other words, tribal governance, and that then drives the need for a new mode of governance. And that actually occurred with the rise of middle-aged small states and city-states. So small states and city-states then became the new larger mode of governance. But the process didn't stop there, of course, because in the Middle Ages, there was, and the late Middle Ages, and with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, technology moved on. Printing presses were invented, and other early industrial technologies. And those meant that the city-state form of governance couldn't cope anymore. So, for example, the Catholic Church, which was then the governing, the central governing concept at the time, was undermined by the printing, because printing democratized knowledge, and so the church lost its grip. And eventually that had to give way to a still larger and more encompassing form of governance, which we know today as the nation state. And today the process has gone on again, and we now have the internet and global technologies and computers and international air travel, globalization, etc. And that is undermining national governance today. And that's why national governments can't deal with the global problems we're facing today. And that's what is now calling forth the global cooperation, global governance that I've been talking about, and which Simpol is one pathway towards. But until that global governance institution is actually in place and actually governing, there is a governance gap. And that's what we have today, where anything that is global, like climate change or multinational corporations or international crime syndicates, anything that's global wins, and anything that's less than global, such as the European Union or individual nation states, lose. And so this gap is the tension that we are living in today. That's what's causing all these crises. And there's a very obvious conclusion to draw, which is that governance needs to be on the same scale as the economy it's trying to govern. It's no good trying to govern a global economy with only national governance. You know, if you try to do that, which is what we're effectively trying to do right now, it's not surprising that problems are running out of control. So the consequences of the current governance gap are myriad. So there's climate change, wealth inequality, out of control financial markets. Like I said, the gap between rich and poor is widening, and it's also driving a backlash against globalization and a retreat towards more nationalist, populist politics and a more of a polarized political scene. And I'll come back to that more in a moment. But when we think about global problems, there's actually just one single dynamic that is preventing nation states from acting. And this is, I think, quite well depicted in this little cartoon image here. And it's a phenomenon I call destructive global competition. It's a vicious circle that all nations are caught in. Because if any nation wants to, for example, solve climate change, if any nation wants to cut its emissions, to do that, it would have to increase taxes and regulations on its corporations. But any government that does that in advance of other governments is only going to make its economy, its businesses, uncompetitive. It's going to put the costs of its businesses up, and that will mean that those businesses become uncompetitive with businesses elsewhere. And so, effectively, any government that moves first doesn't win the race. Instead, they sacrifice their economy. And that's what you see with this guy who's just hitting the winning tape here. He's actually getting his throat cut, basically. And of course, the second guy who's coming in second place has got his finger in his mouth and he's thinking, God, I don't want to go there either. Okay, so this is very much the dynamic that is going on with climate change and with almost any other global problem you care to think of. Any nation that moves first will harm its economy. And so the result, of course, is nobody moves, or only incrementally perhaps, but there are no, so the problem is racing away, and yet the action taken by nations is just through these tiny, insignificant steps, which ultimately are not going to solve the problem. So it's a vicious circle that I call destructive global competition. And that affects almost every problem. But if we look at climate change, you can see the evidence in the newspapers. Here's a quick clip from the Financial Times. Governments remain reluctant to address this threat because any country acting alone to curb its greenhouse gas emissions without similar commitments by other governments risks damaging the competitiveness of its industries. So there you have it. But it's not just climate change. There are a whole load of other issues that suffer from the same problem. If you take with pandemic prevention, you're seeing right now that there's a scramble for certain drugs that seem to be quite effective at dealing with COVID-19, and the US, I think, has sort of tried to grab those, the most of the supply of those drugs, which of course is then going to leave other countries and other people without. So there's this vicious circle going on there. With wealth inequality, it's the same thing. If a government wants to reduce wealth inequality, it's got to raise taxes on the rich. But the rich will just say, well, I'm just going to go somewhere else. So, of course, no government wants to do it because they don't want to lose the tax revenue that they've already got. It's also happening with mass migration, and is causing this backlash against globalization that I mentioned earlier. Because to keep your economy competitive, a government needs to provide relatively cheap labor to keep corporations in the country. And to do that, it has to, of course, have a fairly open border policy, has to allow immigration. But that then has a backlash because it means that many local people are then going to lose their jobs to the new incomers who are potentially willing to work for lower wages. Re-regulating financial markets is another problem. How do you do that when any nation that acted alone would only see the markets move their operations elsewhere? Tax competition and tax avoidance, nuclear disarmament, the classic prisoner's dilemma, all of these issues, including even governance of outer space, are all issues that suffer from destructive global competition. How are we going to regulate the internet? Again, that cannot be done by any nation alone. But there are also very powerful political consequences of destructive global competition. As I said, this need for every government to keep its national economy internationally competitive means that every government, regardless of the party in power, has to implement policies that are attractive to global markets, to multinational corporations, and so forth. So what is the result of that imperative? Well, of course, it means that all governments, whether they are right or left, once they get into power, they have no choice but to adopt a fairly neoliberal, competitiveness-oriented, very narrow range of policy measures. And as I said before, it's a vicious circle because every government knows that if it doesn't stay competitive, business is going to go to other countries. And it's produced what philosopher Jürgen Habermas has referred to as a legitimation crisis. It means that if politicians of whatever party have to implement a very narrow neoliberal competitiveness-oriented range of policies, why bother to vote anymore? So people are losing faith in democracy because destructive global competition has rendered national democracy relatively meaningless. And this is why the political center ground is no longer viable. And we're seeing this extreme polarization of politics right across the West. And this backlash against globalization. And so this is a phenomenon that I actually call pseudo-democracy. We have the trappings of democracy, but actually it doesn't really matter who we vote for because whoever gets in has no choice but to implement this relatively narrow range of neoliberal, free market, competitiveness-oriented policies. And so we are led to believe in the West that the ideal of democracy is a little bit like a theatre stage. And we, the audience, or we, the citizens, are the audience, and our politicians are the actors on the stage, and they do their act, and then we get to elect whoever on the stage we like at an election every 4 or 5 years or whatever. And the actors are laid out across the stage from right to left according to their political leanings. But what's the reality? The reality is that the left side of the stage, and possibly even part of the extreme right, are now out of bounds. And that's all that's really left to us is this tiny sort of center-right section in the middle, which all politicians are sort of now bunched in because they're all pretty much doing the same thing, whoever we elect. So as I say, destructive global competition permits only centre-right free market policies. And that's why right across the West, parties of the left that traditionally supported the working classes can no longer implement the policies to support the working classes. And that's why the working classes are now deserting them and moving to the extreme right as a kind of protest almost. And we've seen this actually in action. You may recall, I think in 2012, Francois Hollande was elected as president of France on a very left-wing, tax the rich kind of policy platform. But what happened? Here's a little clip from the Times that tells us. After 18 months of stagnation under orthodox socialist leadership, Hollande confirmed that he was swinging towards the market-friendly policies adopted over the past 15 years by left-wing parties in Germany, Britain, and elsewhere. In other words, it doesn't matter what a politician says in their manifesto. Once they get elected, they find that they are forced into this neoliberal, that portion of the stage on the center right. So this is pseudo-democracy in action. So what are the initial conclusions? First of all, that policies to save the planet are incompatible with staying internationally competitive. You cannot solve climate change and stay internationally competitive. The two things just do not work together. They are incompatible. Destructive global competition, as I said, it's a vicious circle that our politicians cannot escape. And so what the crucial thing we have to realize, it's not that politicians don't want to act on climate change and on wealth inequality and on all these other issues. It's that they can't. They are stuck in this vicious circle. It is not within their power to exit. And that's why protests, petitions, and all the conventional forms of campaigning that we see NGOs and activist groups undertaking these days, whether it's Extinction Rebellion or Friends of the Earth or Greenpeace or Avaz, that's why they don't generally work, because they are trying to admonish nations to act individually to cut carbon emissions or whatever it may be. But that is asking nations to act against their own interests. It's asking them to voluntarily trash their economies, and they're not going to do that. This is the problem. And that's why it's not working. And that's why our consciousness, the way we think about and understand the world, needs to evolve from a nation-centric way of thinking and acting to a world-centric way of thinking and acting. And it's we citizens actually have to take responsibility for solving this problem. Like I said, politicians are stuck in this vicious circle. They are not going to lead us out of it. We've got to lead them out of it. So as Einstein said, we won't solve current problems with the same thinking that created them. So we need to solve destructive global competition, but there are certain conditions. We can't do it with a world government because we're just not in a position to create one, and I wouldn't be in favor of a world government anyway, and we don't need one. We can't rely on existing global institutions like the United Nations and the IMF and the World Trade Organization, because those institutions are basically run by nation states. We have to operate within existing national political systems because they are the locus of power. They are the locus of political power. But we have to do so without being a political party. Because as I've explained, political parties are subject to destructive global competition. There's no point in being a political party because you'll only end up like Francois Hollande or many of the other parties today. So citizens have got to lead this process. And referring back to John Stewart's point about management, we citizens need to become the managers. We need to start operating like the nucleus did in the protocell to get the protocell to cooperate. So this is all a lead up to how Simple could hopefully help us solve this problem and offers us a pathway to global cooperation. There are 3 P's in Simple: the policy, the pledge, and the process. And I'll just quickly explain those 3 aspects of Simple. So first of all, the policy. The Simple is a range of policies to be implemented by all or sufficient nations simultaneously. Why simultaneously? Because if all nations act together, the vicious circle of destructive global competition is broken. You will only break that vicious circle if we can get nations to act simultaneously. So the simultaneous policy, that's why it's called, that's why it does what it says on the tin, is to be implemented simultaneously by all or sufficient nations. And the policy would only contain issues that nations can't implement alone. Now, that's extremely important because issues that nations can deal with alone obviously can already be dealt with by nations through their normal democratic processes. So those issues have nothing to do with Simple. Simple only deals with those issues that nations can't deal with alone because of destructive global competition. The other important aspect of Simple is that it's a multi-issue policy framework. Instead of trying to deal with global issues one issue at a time, as the United Nations is doing, Simple would mix 2 or more complementary issues together. For example, you would have perhaps a climate agreement alongside a global wealth tax or a global currency transactions tax. The idea being that the proceeds from the tax can be used to compensate the big losers on the climate part of the agreement. The idea being that what a nation might lose on one policy, it can gain on another. The problem and the reason I think that the United Nations COP process is failing at the moment is because it deals just with one issue, which is carbon emissions. And of course, the big emitters of carbon will always have higher costs to bear, and therefore there is no incentive for them to cooperate. That's why the UN process is failing. So we need a multi-issue framework so that what a nation wins loses on the swings, it can gain on the roundabouts. Also, the policy needs to contain detailed policies about what each nation will actually do, not targets. One of the problems with targets is that the UN process, they might all, or the Paris Climate Agreement, they might all agree a target for a global warming of not more than 1.5 degrees or something like that. But no nation knows precisely what every other nation is going to do to achieve that target, and therefore the uncertainty remains, and therefore the fear of competitive disadvantage remains, and that's why no nation is moving. So we need detailed, transparent policies, not targets. Now, Simple is also a range of policies that we're not suggesting that they would all be implemented on one day, a solution to all global problems implemented simultaneously on one day. No, that would be crazy. So what we're talking about is a series of multi-issue policy packages. So you might have one package in year 1, another package in year 3, another package in year 5, and so on. And there, in that process, there would also be an opportunity to revise or change or previous policies. So we're talking about a series of multi-issue policy packages. And they would be designed not by corporations or politicians, but by people, citizens who support Simple. And the actual negotiations on the final policy content of Simple would only take place once governments have signed the Simple pledge. Okay, so the Simple's policy content does not yet exist, and it would be crazy to try to develop it now, because we don't know what the priorities and needs of the world are going to be, when Simple is ready to be implemented. So this is a process. So at the moment, we are getting politicians, parties, and hopefully eventually governments to sign the Simple Pledge. So what is the pledge? The pledge actually it's a one-page document which you can see on our website, but essentially boiled down to one sentence. It is for politicians or parties or governments saying, I pledge to implement the simultaneous policy only if all or sufficient nations have also signed the pledge and if the policy content of Simple has been agreed. Okay, so it's a pledge in principle. And that's to be signed by individual members of parliament or senators, representatives of Congress, or by whole political parties, and eventually by governments. And as you can see, it's a pledge only in principle. And that's important because it builds international trust and confidence, because we're not going to get a global agreement that sticks until we first get all nations or sufficient nations into the room in principle. And if you like, signing the pledge, it's a little bit like saying, I will if you will. It's a declaration on the part of every politician or party or a government that's saying, I'm ready to implement, to negotiate and implement the simultaneous policy if and when you are too. So there's a kind of reciprocity process going on. Now let's move on to the process. How are we actually going to get nations to implement the simultaneous policy? Well, it's very simple. When citizens join Simple, they basically are declaring to their politicians that they will give strong voting preference at all future national elections to politicians or parties who have signed the pledge. And that declaration turbocharges the competition between politicians and between parties. Why is that? Because from a politician's point of view, there is nothing to lose by signing the pledge, because if I'm a politician and I sign the pledge, that means I get a better chance of getting the votes of all the citizens who are Simple supporters. So that's a plus for me. But I also don't have to implement the simultaneous policy until all or sufficient other nations are on board. And so that's a win. But if I choose not to sign up and my competitor candidate at the election does sign up, I could lose my seat. So there's a powerful domino effect that we've witnessed in a number of elections, particularly in the United Kingdom, in parliamentary seats that are very marginal, that are very tightly contested between the parties. Because often what happens is when one candidate signs up, then the next one signs up, then the next one, then the next one, because none of them want to lose out. And so there's this powerful domino effect, and I'll demonstrate that a little bit later. So the point here is that Simple doesn't need a majority of voters to succeed. It only needs the critical number, the critical balance between the two main competing parties to drive both of them to sign up. So like I said, it's a win-win-lose for politicians. If they sign up, they gain a better chance of getting our votes. They also don't have to, that's one win. The second win is that they don't have to implement the simultaneous policy, of course, until all the sufficient nations are on board. So that's a win. But the lose is that if they don't sign up and their competitor does, they could lose their seats. And you might well say to yourself, well, yes, but politicians will sign anything prior to an election and then they just won't act on it, or they'll just cancel it when after the election. But think about it. Simple doesn't get implemented until all or sufficient nations are on board, and therefore there is absolutely no point in a politician cancelling his pledge at any time up until implementation. If a politician cancelled his pledge after the election, it would just be saying to all those Simple supporters in his area, please don't ever vote for me again. So there is just no point in a politician cancelling their pledge, and indeed no politician ever has. So, of course, this process that I'm talking about works in democratic countries where there are elections. But what about the non-democratic countries? Well, the idea is that we get Simpol rolling in democratic countries first, and then non-democratic countries will be invited to join the process at a later date. And if you think about the structure of Simpol that I've outlined, simultaneous implementation, multi-issue policy framework, that is a structure which means that there is nothing to lose for any nation joining the process and everything to gain. And as global problems get worse and worse, non-democratic nations need a solution to them just as much as we do. Let me briefly come back to the domino effect. What you're seeing here on the screen is actually a screenshot from our old website, which we had during the election back in 2017. And what you can see here are the different electoral areas, and one of them is the Vale of Clwyd in Wales. And you can see that the first candidate to sign up was Gwyn Williams, who signed up on the 14th of May 2017. And then, of course, we send a little message to his competitors, the Labour and Conservative competitors, saying, you know, one of your competitors has signed the Simpol pledge. Why put yourself at a competitive disadvantage? As you can see, a few days later, the Labour candidate, Chris Ruane, signed up. And then 1 day after that, in fact, I think that was the day before the election itself, the sitting Member of Parliament, James Davies, the Conservative, also signed up, because with 2 of his competitors having signed up already, he thought, my God, if I don't sign up, I could lose to one of the others. And so he signed up too. So it didn't matter who won the election in that constituency. Whoever won, Simpol gained another Member of Parliament regardless. And so this is what I mean about the domino effect. This is what I mean about citizens becoming the managers. Simpol puts us in control. And so what have our results been so far? Well, in the last UK election in December last year, we got over 700 candidates to sign the Simpol pledge from right across the party political spectrum. And of those, now over 100 are sitting MPs in Westminster. In Ireland, in 2017, we got 53 candidates to sign, and 11 of those are now sitting in the Irish Dáil, the Irish Parliament. In Germany, similarly, we've got about 50 candidates to sign, and we now have 11 members of the Deutsche Bundestag who are now pledged to implement Simpol. And we also have pledged MPs in the European Parliament, Australian Parliament, Denmark, Luxembourg, and 1 or 2 other countries around the world. So this process is already starting to grow. So like I say, we citizens are the managers. Once we actually stop voting for this or that party and turn around to our politicians and say, I'm going to give preference to any politician or party that signs up to Simpol, we are in a much more powerful position. We become the managers. So like I said, non-democratic nations would be invited to join the process because they need solutions to global problems too, and that's going to become increasingly apparent as destructive competition becomes more and more intense and global problems become more and more acute. And the win-win framework means that those nations have got nothing to lose and everything to gain, particularly poorer nations who at present suffer from having to pay massive interest on IMF and World Bank development loans. Through Simpol, we could have redistributions on a debt-free and interest-free basis. Also, Simpol comes from a neutral third position. Simpol is not a proposition that comes from another nation and therefore which other nations might be suspicious of, that might be tainted by the hidden hand of national self-interest. Simpol comes from citizens. It comes from a kind of neutral third position. So I think that is also important. And if there were any rogue nations that held out and that really just refuse to join the process, I'm sure that there could be measures put in place to isolate them, to prevent them from undermining the implementation of Simpol. And as I said, competition drives cooperation. The deepening crisis created by destructive competition increases the incentive to cooperate. That's how evolution works. So for more information, there's a lot of questions I'm sure you'll want answering. How are the policies going to be developed? Who's going to develop them? How will they be negotiated, and so forth? If you go onto the policy page of our website and download the information pack, that'll give you all the details you need. And just before finishing, let me just give you a few quotes that just, I think, underline the evolutionary aspect of Simpol. If you think of Simpol as our potential common nucleus for transforming the world from destructive competition to fruitful cooperation. Here's Arthur Koestler, who was the person who first invented the whole theory of holons and holarchies. Evolutionary progress requires simultaneous, coordinated changes of all the relevant components in the structure and function of the organic holarchy. Here's evolutionary biologist David Sloan Wilson, who commented on my book, The Simpol Solution. It's a pleasure to read a book that captures the modern evolutionary worldview so well, and your actual solution is very clever. We even share an awareness of the need for a psychological therapeutic process and a global policy-making process. And here's Ken Wilber, the inventor of integral theory. The central idea of Simpol is very powerful. That is, the notion of how to link votes in one country with votes in another, how to link political action in one country with action in another. International competition is built into the nation-state system at its current level of development. And so the issue is not environmental concerns, but how to get humans to agree on environmental concerns. This is really fascinating and very hopeful. In my opinion, this is the crucial issue for the 21st century. So if you want a fuller explanation of Simpol, there is my book co-written with Nick Duffel, who is a psychotherapist and psychohistorian. And Nick's contribution to the book was essential because it's about the way we think. You know, these are, like Einstein said, we won't solve present problems with the same thinking that created them. That's why our thinking needs to move on from its current nation-centric level to a world-centric level. And Nick Duffel was instrumental in helping me to express that. So finally, I would just invite you to sign on to Simpol. It's free. It just takes a couple of minutes. And you can do that at simpol.org. So thank you very much indeed for listening to me. And if you have any questions, please email us or get in touch. Thank you very much.